A gun was pointed at a grieving mother during her own son's military funeral. Not just any mother, a four-star general who had spent her life serving the same country that was now watching her kneel in the dirt. And the man holding that gun wasn't an enemy soldier. He was a police officer. Yeah, that really happened. The morning started the way military funerals usually do. Quiet, heavy, respectful. Fog rolled in from the ocean and wrapped around the cemetery like a blanket nobody wanted. Rows of white headstones stretched toward the cliff, and the wind coming off the water carried that cold smell of salt and damp grass. General Alicia Harper stood beside the casket, her son's casket hands clasped tight inside white gloves, staring at the folded flag across the polished wood. She had buried soldiers before, plenty of them. When you serve long enough, you learn that war eventually brings everyone home in a box. But this was different. This was her son Marcus, 32 years old, a decorated sergeant who had followed his mother into the army because he believed in what she believed in. And now she was standing there in full dress uniform, medals shining in the gray light, trying to hold herself together while the chaplain spoke words she barely heard. Her sister Sophia stood behind her, whispering a hymn. Major Elias Grant leaned on his cane a few feet away, and the soldiers forming the honor guard held their rifles steady, even though everyone could feel the tension in the air. Grief does that. It makes the world slow down, makes people speak softer, walk slower, breathe carefully, like any sudden movement might break something fragile. Then the sound of tires crunching gravel cut straight through the silence. A police cruiser rolled up behind the line of military vehicles, stopping harder than it should have for a funeral. At first, nobody thought much about it. Local police sometimes showed up at ceremonies like this, traffic control, security checks, that kind of thing. But the man who stepped out of that car didn't move like someone there to help. Officer Derek Voss slammed the door, adjusted the belt on his uniform, and started walking toward the service, with a look on his face that had nothing to do with respect. Broad shoulders, sunburned, skin eyes fixed straight ahead. Alicia noticed him only when one of the guards whispered quietly, "Ma'am," local law enforcement checking the perimeter. She turned slightly out of habit, professional courtesy more than anything else. And the second she saw the name tag on his chest, her stomach tightened. Voss. 15 years earlier, she had known that name very well. Back when she was still a colonel stationed in Iraq, Derek Voss had been a soldier under her command. And one day he made the mistake of shouting a racial slur across a motor pool, calling another black soldier a monkey right there in uniform, like he thought war gave him permission to say anything he wanted. Alicia didn't scream at him. She didn't threaten him. She simply reported it the way the Army expects its officers to do. Clean, direct, no drama. The investigation stripped him of rank, ended his military career, and sent him home angry enough to carry that resentment for the rest of his life. Standing there on that cliff 15 years later, he looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has blamed for every failure he ever had. Voss walked closer, boots thudding against the gravel until he stood just a few steps away from the coffin. The ceremony paused, people glancing back and forth, trying to figure out what was happening. Alicia kept her voice calm. "Officer Voss," she said, polite but firm. "This is a military funeral. Step back." He smirked like he'd been waiting years to hear her say his name. "You still hiding behind those stars, General," he muttered. Sophia leaned forward behind Alicia and whispered, "Just ignore him." But it was already too late. Voss's hand dropped to his holster, the leather snapping open with a sound that turned the entire crowd stiff. Elias stepped forward instantly, his voice sharp. "Derek, don't." But the gun was already out. The metallic click echoed across the stones as he pointed the Glock straight at Alicia's chest. "Get on your knees, General." For a second, nobody moved. It's strange how the brain reacts in moments like that. Half the people there probably thought they were mishearing him. A police officer pointing a gun at a decorated general during her son's funeral. That doesn't fit into any normal explanation your mind has. Voss raised his voice, shaking with anger. "I said on your knees, now!" A little boy wearing a tiny army cap started crying. The chaplain raised both hands, whispering, "Please, please." Elias took another step forward, but stopped when Voss's finger tightened on the trigger. Alicia understood the danger instantly. One wrong move and someone else could die on that hill. So she did something that shocked everyone watching. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered herself to her knees in the damp grass beside her son's coffin. Not out of fear, out of discipline. Her voice stayed steady. "You've done enough damage in this life, officer." Voss laughed under his breath, breathing hard. "You think you're untouchable," he said. "You ruined my life. Now I ruin yours." And then he fired. The warning shot exploded into the air, the sound bouncing across the cemetery and rolling down toward the ocean. Children screamed. Soldiers ducked on instinct. The shell casing spun across the gravel and stopped beside a headstone marked "Unknown Soldier." But the moment that changed everything came from someone else. Lieutenant Mia Reyes had been assigned to security that morning, standing off to the side, watching the perimeter like trained officers do. The instant that shot went off, she ran, boots pounding across the walkway. 40 yards in seconds. One fast movement. Elbow into Voss's wrist twist, and the gun flew from his hand, sliding across the stone path before 2 military guards tackled him to the ground. Voss thrashed under their grip, shouting curses as they pinned him face down. "You don't know who she is!" he yelled at Reyes. She answered without hesitation. "Yeah, I do." Through all of it, Alicia stayed kneeling beside the coffin, her hands resting on her head, eyes distant, like she had been pulled back into some battlefield memory nobody else could see. The wind picked up again, lifting the corner of the flag on Marcus's casket, and just a few yards away, a young veteran named Jamal Reed was holding a phone and shaking hands. He had been live-streaming the ceremony for a veterans page online. At first, he thought he might stop recording out of respect, but something told him to keep filming. "This can't be real," he whispered. But it was. Within an hour, that video was everywhere. Millions of people watched the same moment. The officer shouting the gun pointed at the general, the shot echoing through the cemetery. Comment sections exploded. Veterans demanded answers. News networks replayed the footage again and again. Meanwhile, inside a temporary command tent near the bluff, Alicia sat quietly at a folding table while investigators rushed around her. Sophia tried to get her to drink water, but her hands were still trembling slightly. Outside, Elias argued with a police sergeant who seemed more annoyed than apologetic. "You're not detaining her," Elias snapped. "She's the victim." By afternoon, the police department released its first public statement, calling the event a misunderstanding during a security concern. Jamal read that statement sitting in his car and shook his head slowly. "A misunderstanding," he muttered. "The whole world just watched it." As the video spread, reporters gathered outside the base gates. Protesters began organizing downtown, and federal investigators quietly started reviewing Officer Voss's history. What they found wasn't pretty. 12 prior complaints, multiple suspensions, 2 lawsuits quietly settled. One report from years earlier where he had pointed a gun at a black reservist during a traffic stop and called it routine procedure. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about one horrible moment at a funeral. It was about a system that had allowed that moment to happen. Alicia watched the chaos unfold from her sister's house that night, the folded flag from Marcus's coffin resting on the table beside her. Elias called to apologize again for not warning her sooner about Voss's hatred. She listened quietly and finally said, "Silence is how people like him survive." The federal investigation that followed uncovered even more disturbing details. Voss had spent years tracking Alicia online, collecting screenshots of her speeches, promotions, and public appearances. He posted about her on private forums using fake names, calling her a traitor in uniform. One message written the night before the funeral said everything investigators needed to know. "Tomorrow I face my demon." When the trial finally began months later, the courtroom was packed with reporters, veterans, and curious citizens. The prosecution started with the video. No dramatic narration, just the raw footage playing on a large screen while the room watched in silence. Lieutenant Reyes testified first, explaining exactly how she disarmed Voss and why she believed he intended to fire again. Elias Grant took the stand next and admitted the truth about Voss's racist outburst 15 years earlier. Then Alicia herself walked to the witness chair. She swore the oath calmly and answered every question without raising her voice. When the prosecutor asked what went through her mind as the gun pointed at her chest, she said something that stayed with everyone listening. "I thought about my son," she said quietly, "and I thought about how none of the wars I survived prepared me for a gun aimed at me on American soil." The defense tried to argue stress, confusion, emotional instability, but their case collapsed when prosecutors introduced Voss's own notebook recovered from his home, pages filled with angry writing blaming Alicia for destroying his life. One drawing showed 4 military stars with bullet holes through them. And then Voss himself made the final mistake. When the judge gave him a chance to speak, he stood up and said, "She made me kneel first, 15 years ago." Gasps spread through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward slowly. "So this was revenge," he said. The jury didn't need long. 3 hours later, they returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on every count. Civil rights violations, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, hate crime under color of law. The sentence was life in prison without parole. When Voss was led out of the courtroom, he looked at Alicia and muttered, "You win." She shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "My son is still gone." In the months that followed, the country debated everything about the case. Police accountability, racial bias, the power of video evidence. Alicia didn't spend much time on television interviews. Instead, she started the Harper Foundation in her son's name, providing legal aid and mental health support for veterans who had faced discrimination after returning home. California lawmakers passed new oversight laws for police departments, and other states began adopting similar reforms. But even now, years later, people still argue about what happened that morning on the cliff above the ocean. Some say it proves the system can correct itself when injustice becomes impossible to ignore. Others say the truth only came out because the victim was a powerful general whose story couldn't be buried. And that raises a question I think a lot of us are still wrestling with. If Alicia Harper had been an ordinary citizen instead of a 4-star general, would the outcome have been the same? Would anyone have believed her without that video? Or would it have quietly disappeared like so many other stories we never hear about? I'd really like to know what you think about that. Was justice served here, or did it only happen because the entire world was watching? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever seen something similar happen in real life, a moment where power, prejudice, and truth collided, share your story too. Because sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that matter most.